So hello, everybody. Welcome to today's AMICAL event brought to you by the Information Literacy Initiatives Committee. Yeah, that's the new name. It's entitled From Transactional to Integral, Re-envisioning Information Literacy. And my name is Michael Stopel from the American University of Paris. I'm pleased to welcome Carrie Donovan and Lechtenberg from the University of Pittsburgh system. And they will speak to us actually about re-envisioning information literacy. And as I said, the title of today's talk is From Transactional to Integral. I want to say thank you also to my co-moderator, Meredith Saba, who actually established the first link to Carrie and to Ula. She had read like that fantastic article by both of them. And so I want to send my regards right here to Meredith that she established that link. So the flowers go to you here.
Thank you, Michael.
Carrie and Ula, we agreed that before the today's webinar, we said that they're going to introduce themselves. So they're going to introduce each other actually. So I will skip that part. So I'm not gonna take the time up right here. Before we start, maybe a quick note on housekeeping. Carrie and Ula, so they will present for 30 minutes and then they're going to take questions. At that moment, Meredith, she will jump in, but we also will stop the recordings because we believe that this is going to be beneficial for the conversation afterwards. And at the end, Meredith, she's going to lead like the conversation and the questions, and she's going to wrap up at the end. But so much for now from my side. I think Carrie and Ula, it's all yours. Please take it away. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And thank you, Meredith, for inviting us. We really appreciate the opportunity to be here with all of you. I want to introduce you to my colleague, Ula Lechtenberg. So Ula is the Learning Design Coordinator at the University of Pittsburgh Library System, where she focuses on empowering partnerships between faculty and librarians in order to support student learning across the disciplines. And she's interested in doing this in innovative and exciting ways, some of which she'll talk to us about today. But she also leads our LibGuides at our library, and she's very passionate about not using a LibGuide unless you absolutely need to. She's an international thought leader on that. So, so that's my introduction about Ula, and go ahead and switch it over to you.
Thank you so much, Carrie. I am very happy to introduce my colleague, Carrie Donovan. She is the head of research learning and media for Hillman Library at the University of Pittsburgh Library System. She's held different jobs in the profession, but I think all of them have had something to do with teaching and learning. And she's very passionate about building on students' prior knowledge as they learn how to engage in the research process. She's also a huge fan of incorporating play and creativity into her teaching and learning as well.
Thank you so much, Ula. And before we really get started, we also wanted to acknowledge we're at the University of Pittsburgh, which occupies the ancestral land of the Adena and Hopewell cultures and the Monongahela peoples. In hopes to build awareness and forge a better future, we pay respect to their elders and their past, present, and future peoples, cultures, languages, and communities. So we'd like to next give you kind of an overview of what we hope to talk with you about today. And then as Michael mentioned, we're going to have plenty of time for discussion and questions. So we look forward to talking with everyone. But if you have questions as we're going, please feel free to pop those in the chat. While I'm speaking, Ula will watch the chat. And then while she's talking, I will do that as well. So basically, our outline is I'm going to be talking us through library instruction through the one-shot instruction model and how our professional identities, our library organizations, and our priorities situate around that. And Ula will discuss some really practical possibilities for sustainable instructional practice and some strategies that we've both employed that we believe may be transferable to your settings. But we're also really interested in hearing how you do things at your institutions, and we're excited to learn from all of you as well during the discussion. So to kind of set the stage for all of this, we did share one of our favorite articles by Susanna Cowan entitled "The Battle We Won That We Lost," which if you didn't have a chance to look at that yet, it describes the need for us to really set information literacy free. So Susanna Cowan writes about how even though we in libraries had a major win by initiating library instruction and evolving it into information literacy, our need to continue to have ownership of this knowledge domain, or as she says, something that is run from within libraries by librarians, could be our biggest loss, because it keeps information literacy from being integrated into the context of teaching and learning across disciplines at our institutions. So as we read in the article, by having this discussion, we're not trying to demolish information literacy, but we are instead hoping to guarantee its survival. And this really means taking a long, hard look at one-shot instruction sessions, which center librarians as the resident experts and sole purveyors really of this knowledge. So I think what we'd like to begin with is by really looking at those one-shots. And Ula and I recently had the opportunity to make a contribution to a special issue of College and Research Libraries on one-shots. And I believe Ula is going to pop into the chat the link to the table of contents. So you can see all of the great authors that we had the opportunity to engage with as part of this process. But as Nicole Pagowski, our editor of the special issue on one-shots, said, if we don't problematize one-shots, they become nature, basically just the way of things. So that's why we want to kind of ask these questions about one-shots and really talk to you today about that instructional model, how we got here, some of the problems associated with it, and what we could do to potentially evolve past that. So way back when library instruction began, it kind of had to be a one-shot because we were introducing students to a place and to print materials in that place. And we were just getting a toehold into teaching and learning at our institutions. So as we evolved and information literacy became more conceptual rather than skills-based, it became clear to us that deeper learning around the research process could happen if it were based around students' prior knowledge and experience and integrated into what they were learning in their majors. So if we knew all of that way back then, I wager to say the one-shot is not the instructional model we would have gone with. So I think because some of the reasons that we have listed here that were illustrated in that special issue of College and Research Libraries, one of those is because it marginalizes librarians' labor and deprioritizes students' experiences. In addition, in the one-shot instructional model, information literacy cannot be sustainable and integrated into student learning. So in the one-shot model, we're really reacting to requests for library service. In fact, in this model, the more requests that we get, ostensibly, the better our service is, right? But this is a dangerous proposition because if we're teaching more and more, this can result in burnout. So for instruction librarians who have no choice but to say yes to every request for instruction, it can feel like you have no agency in the teaching and learning process. And it really situates librarians in the role of service provider rather than educational partner. So the other thing I want to mention is that in this model, our teaching is subject to exploitation as our institutions continue to double down on the rhetoric of impact and value, resulting in this culture of more, just teaching more, having higher and higher numbers. And this is something that Ula and I talk a lot about. I'm sure she'll circle back around to in her session too. So the other thing to note is through the one-shot model, we can get dangerously close to what Paulo Freire described in his banking model of education in the pedagogy of the oppressed, in which students are simply empty vessels to be filled by instructors. And this is really not aligned with our hopes for students, right? We want them to be engaged in the process of learning, to co-create that process with us, to really see themselves as engaged partners in the research and learning process. So with all of this in mind, why don't we ask more questions about the one-shot instructional model that we've had for so long? Well, it's because this is not an entirely natural mindset for us. Many of us have only known this way of teaching our whole careers. In fact, you know, when we take a job, usually we're handed this instructional model from our predecessors. So it takes a long time and kind of a lot of thinking and talking to come around to this way of understanding things, and you kind of have to experience the unfortunate fallout of one-shots yourself in order to recognize that they are part of a bigger system of oppression that relegates librarians in a service role and limits student learning. So I think I'd like to talk a little bit next about some of the ways in which we got here. So let's first talk about libraries as institutions and as workplaces, okay? So when we join a library as an organization, this is our professional community, right? So we're collectively shaped by the established ways of thinking, communicating, and working that become common in these communities. And with these longstanding organizational practices in place, it's really no wonder that we become entrenched in those ideas too. So what the result of all of that is an organizational culture that sets up beliefs and practices that can go unquestioned. And that's kind of the same thing with one-shots, you know, it's just part of the way we do things. So we're not always asking questions about it. So I think we've become accustomed to teaching in the mode of a one-shot, simply because, you know, this is really the expectations of the organizations that we're part of. And it goes a little bit deeper too, to how we see ourselves as librarians and educators. So we are also part of the system and have a role in establishing and perpetuating it. So for each of us, we're driven by a sense of self that is manifest in our personal identity and includes our dispositions, abilities, and it's a professional and a social identity. So as we develop more expertise and gain experience in the world, our identity grows stronger, and it can offer us a sense of agency and power. And once developed, our identities are resistant to change. This is what gives them their stability, right? So we find ourselves working in the information landscape and in these organizations that are constantly undergoing change. But where we find our stability is in our sense of self, that thing that we really know about ourselves to be true. We carry that with us through every job that we have. And this can really give us a sense of power and security in our organizations, even amidst a lot of change. So it's difficult to let go of. And if part of our identity is around teaching, especially teaching one-shots, in which we receive a lot of accolades from students, we receive a lot of gratitude from the faculty that we teach with. The idea of letting that go can be very difficult. So, so I think it makes sense then that our identities are particularly appealing to us when we're facing ambiguity. And, you know, it is that one thing that is stable for us. But one shot's kind of being in our comfort zone, the thing that we know, the thing that we drive, that exists within our own knowledge domain. It kind of keeps us in a role of service providers rather than focusing on what faculty, students, and researchers need and how we can partner with them in that process. So when we're advocating for information literacy in a one-shot model, what we're saying is we're able to provide this service for you to connect with your students in this particular way, in this particular model. Instead of really advocating for students themselves and what they need to know. So another big piece of this that I've experienced is that teaching is often very performative. It can be a lot about like crafting your set over time, right? And this was perfect for me. I loved this because I was an introvert. I am an introvert and not really accustomed to teaching. So thinking of it more as like a performance really made it so I could step back and not bring my whole self to that situation. But that's not really what we want to do either. We want to bring our whole selves to our interactions with students and have it be meaningful and have it be authentic. So the other thing I'll say about our teaching in the one-shot model is because this exists beyond any formalized curricula, there's not an established and understood way of measuring the impact of our teaching in a world in which credit hours and grades are still the primary drivers of learning assessment. So this leaves our teaching a little bit in the dark and therefore unrecognized and underappreciated. So I'd like to kind of take a moment for us to kind of shift our focus now to think about if we were to start to move away from one shots, kind of, you know, having asked all these questions. We will talk about some practical ways in which we can start to shift our teaching into different instructional models. But what I'm proposing is what has to accompany that practice is a re-envisioning of also how we see ourselves and those deeply held beliefs that we have about teaching that are so ingrained in our workplace. So this is really a paradigm shift that Urszula and I are proposing to move our thinking from librarians and the way we teach to students and what they need in order to learn. So you can think about this kind of in terms of equality and equity. Equality is really about leveling the playing field. All students having access to the same materials. But equity is about giving students the flexibility and opportunity to discover their needs and to choose from multiple ways of meeting those needs. So with an equity approach, we're really decentering ourselves, our knowledge domains, and prioritizing the needs of our students. And Urszula will talk about some ways of putting this paradigm shift into practice.
Thank you so much, Carrie. So as we start to think about moving away from focusing on the way that we teach to student learning, kind of wanted to talk about the things that kind of the foundations to some of our conversations between Carrie and myself in what it means to center student learning. So, we had a lot of discussions in leading up to writing that article for the special issue of College and Research Libraries. We only had so much space to be able to write what we wanted. And there is a lot of theory and practice that forms our foundations. So Carrie was just talking about equity and equality, and that really ties into universal design for learning. So we have diverse learners across our institutions, and traditional practices, in quotation marks, traditional, are not working for all learners. And universal design for learning that kind of forces us to build curricula, build activities, grading from the ground up to account for the diversity of learners is really something that we should be doing across higher education. And this allows for incorporating different learning preferences, not as an afterthought, but built in to what we do. And this leads to viewing students as whole people. So Carrie was talking about, bringing ourselves as teachers, as whole people, but students also having their own experiences, being active participants in their information environment. So they know how to search for information potentially that relates to their personal lives, but they may be new to what it means to be in academia or in higher education. And this is particularly true of first generation students who do not have anyone in their life who could, they could look to for guidance or experience with academia. But even those students with some kind of support system will have questions about norms and expectations that they might not know to ask about, they might not want to ask about. And this is commonly referred to as the hidden curriculum in higher education. So things that we expect people to know, but they're never explicitly taught. And so how would they really know them unless they had some insider knowledge? And then leading into focusing on the process over product. And so our students are very concerned with the end product of whatever they're doing, right? Because they know they need to write a research paper, for example, to get a grade, and they want to get their degree in order to get a job, right? So they're focused on that product, but to get the skills across, they need to be shown what the process is. The skills within the umbrella of information literacy are not tied to a specific assignment or class. They appear in different parts of our academic and everyday lives. So even though students want to just focus on that product, how do we weave the process, teaching them the process throughout the entire curriculum? And then thinking about thinking or metacognition to reinforce learning. So incorporating this practice to encourage reflection and make students more aware of their learning, of how they're learning, of what they're learning, and making it more meaningful. And with all of these factors in mind, we cannot one-shot our way through this. It's unsustainable, and we don't want to be doing it alone anyway. And I'm saying that as someone who has tried to do these things in one shot. Trying to incorporate good pedagogical practice into the one-shot model, to incorporate these elements, it's still unsustainable for just librarians to be doing. And I want to bring it back to the Cowan article, that we had sent ahead of time and that Carrie mentioned earlier in the presentation, the battle we won that we lost. In that article, Cowan says that information literacy is alive and well and should be, but perhaps not by that name, and perhaps not in the hands, at least not mostly in the hands of librarians. Information literacy must, like so many other library services, enter the educational commons in the sense of a collaborative network of pedagogies and practices that crosses internal and external institutional boundaries and has no home because it lives in no one place. So how does that happen? How do we do that? There are different practical strategies that both Carrie and I have worked with at a variety of institutions of different types and sizes, including our current place of work, which is a large research institution. So I want to kind of give a broad overview with some specific examples of some of these sustainable practices. So first we have scaffolding, and this takes a couple of meetings. The first meeting is from the library's perspective, scaffolding learning about research and information literacy throughout the curriculum. So again, from the library's perspective, what do first-year students need to know when it comes to the research process? What do subject-specific or majors need to know? What are the outcomes? What do they look like? And then what do graduate students need to know when it comes to the research process? If you have graduate students at your institution. Planning approaches in this way from the library's perspective, again, sort of limits repetition and supports learning in many different ways. So that's kind of a broad way of looking at scaffolding, even potentially curriculum mapping of what the library can do to help all of those different populations. The next point is incentivization programs for faculty. And so paying teaching faculty to engage with this topic and incorporate it into their courses and assignments. And I know this can be very difficult for some at institutions with limited budgets or no opportunities for outside funding. But if you can afford it, you should do it. You should try it. So at my previous place of work, I was on the planning committee for a 2-day faculty institute, a 2-day workshop that sort of asked faculty to engage with information literacy instruction in their own courses. And we had representation from across disciplines. So there were STEM folks, there were people from the humanities, the social sciences. So this was a 2-day workshop that the librarians developed, different activities throughout the 2 days, essentially modeling to faculty what they could be doing with their students to help them realize that this type of learning is perfectly suited in what they already do in the classroom. And so this brings me to the second sort of meaning of scaffolding. We introduced scaffolding of the research assignment to faculty. So instead of assigning a paper at the end of the semester, we encourage them to break it up into smaller pieces to incorporate across the semester to reinforce those information literacy skills and potentially get a much better product from students because they learned the process through that sort of model. We also talked about common pitfalls and assumptions, and describing what we see as librarians when students engage in research, because I think that's our biggest contribution in collaborating with faculty. We see students in the moment of research when they're engaging with it, and we can speak to that in our expertise. Design consultations. So this takes a couple of meanings too. So designing the collaboration between library and instructor. So instead of sort of defaulting to the one shot, opening a conversation with the teaching faculty. So This is something that we've just transitioned to at the University of Pittsburgh. We had an instruction request form, and now we have a consultation form. So rather than sort of making, offering up the one shot as the only option, opening it up the conversation and saying, hey, what are your learning goals? And we can talk about the best way to reach those learning goals. So there are no assumptions that it should be a one shot. What are some of the other options? We could do a course guide. We could do a guided lesson plan that the teaching faculty incorporates into their semester or term. Maybe we make a video or a tutorial. Maybe it should be a whole course. And I'm not saying like an information literacy course, but a whole course is co-designed by librarians and faculty to seamlessly integrate those information literacy skills to whatever subject or discipline that faculty member is teaching. And finally, and I'll mention one more thing with consultations, design consultations, designing assignments. So will the students provide the kind of product the instructor expects based on the way it's presented? And again, our expertise of like seeing students engage in research at the time that they're working on these assignments, we can see, again, those common pitfalls. We can guide instructors toward the product they want by helping them improve the process and experience for their students. Finally, the digital learning objects as online learning opportunities for information literacy. They can complement what instructors are doing in their courses, or potentially even replace what they're doing, what we're doing in their courses. These can be most suited to be concept-based versus tools-based, but local tools are important too. So making tutorials and videos about local tools can be very useful to your student population. And something to consider, these videos and tutorials can be homegrown. You can subscribe to them. There are vendors that offer suites of videos and tutorials, or you can compile them from different options across the internet, because librarians have been making these types of tools for many, many years. So, and we like sharing most of the time. So just as another example of a real life example of sustainable instructional practice, I'm going to ask Meredith to share something that she has worked on towards that sustainable practice.
Thank you so much, Ula. So I'll be brief, but one other example that we're doing at AUC, we have actually shifted over the last 3 years from an all in-person model of teaching our information literacy course through the semester to an all online model during the pandemic with Zoom, to a hybrid model actually between the two in 2021 towards the end, when we came back to campus in part. And then just recently, over the last 6 months now, we've been developing a self-paced version of this course, where it's very flexible for our students to take online at their own learning pace, at their own time from home. And this is great because it does a few things. Number one, it gives the students ways to interactively work with the material online a little bit more at their own pace, as I mentioned. And this is content that could be also integrated into other courses in the future, perhaps. So this is a course in and of itself, but the elements of it could also be used with other courses on campus later on if we want to integrate that into Blackboard for other disciplines and so on. We have videos, for example, and interactive activities that could be embedded into the curriculum a little bit more in other courses. We also, this also gives us some free time. It frees up the instructor time because we spend a lot of time teaching this LALT course. It's a big chunk of our job right now. And so this gives instructors a way to do other things and focus on other things outside of just teaching this course. For example, working more with the faculty and the disciplines on certain projects and integrating these skills at a more advanced level in a subject-specific way. So, I think there's a lot of different ways we could do this, and I love the examples that you guys have provided as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your own example. And, we'll have time to talk about others at the end of after the presentation. In general, Carrie and I are asking you to consider processes that strengthen librarians' positionality as instructors and co-learners rather than trainers. Library workers who are cared for and not burnt out can envision and reprise their instruction through these types of partnerships and changes. However, this may mean stepping back from typical commitments to re-envision what could be moving forward. And this is kind of the note that we want to end on, that there's kind of these parallel timelines. So you've got like the long-term big changes that you might want to make towards re-envisioning the information literacy programs that you have. But what are the things in the short term that you can do to kind of work towards those goals? So self-empowerment is key for doing this work. If you are a coordinator or manager, that means you offer your support and advocacy for, higher ups, towards higher ups, but encourage people to start small with something they have complete control over. And so Carrie mentioned earlier the culture of more, and I think this really ties into our practices in assessment. So we have viewed that like quality or quantity is really important. More instruction sessions somehow means that we have more value as librarians or the library in general. And I don't think that's necessarily true based on what Carrie shared earlier. So quality over quantity in terms of the number of sessions that we feel like we need to do. However, that does mean that we will have declining statistics. And so what is the new narrative around what we're doing as a result? And just making sure that we share that that's going to happen with people, share that that's going to happen with all of our stakeholders, that if that is the goal to reduce the number of one-shots, then that means that the statistics are going to decline. I think that's everything I wanted to say. Is there anything you wanted to add, Carrie, here?
Thank you, Ula. I think that sounded really good.
Well, fantastic. We are ready to have a conversation with everyone in attendance.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Ula and Carrie, for that wonderful presentation. And, I think this is such an issue that we talk about constantly in the world of librarianship. How can we better embed ourselves into the curriculum, for example, and the dream of having, some sort of model or system in which we're not just teaching these one-shot classes, but we're also integrating the skills over a 4-year period, for example, for undergraduate students from year 1 to the time they graduate, that there's more sort of advanced skills being integrated into their courses as they approach graduation, and that they're leaving, with a set of information skills that are more advanced from the time that they started. So yeah, this is, and I love the way that you put this too, with the reactionary versus the more proactive and more integrated approach as a co-partner, co-creative partner with faculty on campus to design these types of models. So I want to thank you all again, and we are going to open up the floor to questions now. Before I do that, I'm going to actually stop the recording, just in case anybody wants to ask a question that may or may not be comfortable with recording. That's fine. We can stop the recording now. Thank you all.